Thank you very much.
Sure.
So I'm going to change gears a bit and talk about multinational research. It's interesting when you look at different decision-making processes that go on around the world, and I'll just take one as an example in terms of end-of-life decision-making. Deborah Cook has shown that there are wide variations between countries, even within countries, within cities, and even in the same ICU, depending on who the attending physician is that week, you may have a different decision, in this case in terms of end-of-life decision-making, but it also may be related to other therapies or other variables that are extremely important in terms of the way we practice medicine and obviously can impact on the way we would collect data for research. So in thinking about the problems of multinational research, I thought it would be helpful to perhaps give you examples of some of the issues that are involved and some of the problems that we've had in some of our multinational research projects. Some relate to definitions, informed consent, how you choose sites, data collection, costs, various comparisons, and what are the problems making these comparisons. And something I think that's important for us as intensivists in terms of looking at a certain culture of research. So if we look through the literature over the years, there have been more and more studies coming from ICUs in various journals, and interestingly enough, there have been more and more multinational research studies also being published. I thought I would look a little bit about differences between ICUs in different countries, and here's some data from critical care medicine looking at the number of ICU beds in different countries as compared to the total number of hospital beds, and you see that you have various countries that are sort of on a line, but there are certain countries that have more ICU beds than others in terms of the proportion of total hospital beds. And if you look at the Eureka study, just making some general comments, here we have the number of patients in the various European countries, and you can see the numbers of patients. Here we look at SAP scores. There are certain variabilities in severity of scores within different country units, and also, interestingly enough, between the different sizes of the hospitals that are being studied. Here we have mortality rates. There are some that are rather low and some that are a bit higher. Here we have the occupancy rates. This study showed that there were many hospitals, ICUs, that were sort of used for perioperative patients, and some are rather low and some rather high. You don't see too many with 100% occupancies, which you can see in certain countries. Turnover, most of the patients admitted and discharged are typically during the week as opposed to the weekends. What about sepsis in the ICU? That's one of our biggest problems. And if you look at the percentage of patients with sepsis as a function of the number of ICU beds, looking at the different countries, here are the countries with less ICU beds, and you can actually see more sepsis. You can also see an increased sepsis mortality. Here's data, other multi-center studies, not looking at the previous study, but here's some SOAP data, again looking at mortalities over the various countries related to sepsis, and again something related to different countries. And here is the SAPS-3 data looking at ICU mortality as a function of the number of beds. And again, the UK sort of stands out as not having many beds and having more sepsis and higher mortalities. So let's talk a little bit about some of the problems, some of the definitions. The first most important definition is what is an intensive care unit. And different definitions have been used for what an intensive care unit is. Is it related to a level 3? Is it a different level? Does it include coronary care patients? Not. So it's important to start with the same definition. If we're studying a various parameter, it's important that we use the same definition. Here's some information related to delirium. Only 54% of 24 authors from academic communities throughout countries and regions that speak the 13 variants of the Romanic language use the term delirium to indicate the disorder as defined by the DSM-4 as an acute change in mental status, inattention, disorganized thinking, and altered level of consciousness. So when we're setting up studies, it's extremely important that we define various disease states and various parameters prospectively. Informed consent is a real problem. The requirements for informed consent are typically much stricter in the United States than in Europe. The U.S., as we all know, is more litigious, and IRBs, one of the reasons actually I went to law school at the University of Miami at night was when we were doing our first septic shock study, the attorney on the IRB told me it's illegal and you can't do it. And after an attorney on an IRB says something, there's not much else anyone else can say. The law school helped a bit, but not to change the attorney's ideas about informed consent at that institution. And even within the same country, and certainly in different countries, IRBs can make different decisions about various requirements. In Europe, the directive set conditions for medicinal trials and has been a problem in terms of the kind of research that we can do on intensive care patients. So that research can only be done with the written and signed informed consent by the research participant or his or her legal representative. And in emergencies, the legal representative obviously is not available and the patient cannot consent him or herself. So that in general, many clinical trials cannot be performed in the EU based on this directive unless the country may have specific statutes allowing some research. And some countries have these, but many do not. As far as the U.S., the FDA developed what is called the final rule, which allows a narrow exception, allowing for emergency procedures and research to go ahead without the requirement for written informed consent from the patient or authorized legal representative. So when we did the ETHICAT study, which was a study of patient, family, physician, or nurses' attitudes related to end-of-life care, we had a waiver of informed consent in the Czech Republic, Israel, Holland, Portugal, and Sweden, but UK required that every person filling out the questionnaire would have to sign an informed consent form. The Corticus study, informed consent varies. Some countries had waivers of informed consent with an independent person signing for the patient when the patient could not sign because of septic shock, whereas other countries in Germany, they had to have the legal representative sign, and that was only after that person was appointed by a judge. In setting up the Welpica study, which is a worldwide consensus development study just of questionnaires of healthcare professionals, not involving patients, not involving families, in Brazil we had the major problem that the national IRB would not allow the study to be performed. So we're still working on it in certain centers, but there are major hurdles sometimes related to informed consent. What about choosing sites? How do we choose site? Many times there could be a certain bias because we typically don't randomize the sites. Many times it's based on networking and colleagues interested in the study. In the ETHICA study, which was a study of end-of-life practices, we really looked at those people interested in ethics and end-of-life issues. There was a lot of work involved, and the work would not be performed unless people were really motivated to do this. In the ELDICUS study, where we were developing a triage score, we had to look at those units who did not have enough ICU beds in countries where they had patients who were both admitted and refused. In some of the Scandinavian countries, in Germany, in Austria, where they typically admitted everyone, you couldn't develop a triage score if everyone was being admitted. So you needed a certain percentage of patients who were being refused. In the Corticus study, we could only use investigators with equipoise for steroid therapy and whether they would or would not use ACTH stimulation tests. And there were centers who believed that steroids should be used in septic shock and therefore did not participate.